Little by little, as the water worked its way into the cracks in the Earth's crust, it produced further fires, explosion, and eruptions. Hence the large number of volcanoes during the first days of the world. What an ingenious hypothesis! I cried, rather in spite of myself. Which Sir Humphrey brought to my notice by means of a highly simple experiment on this very spot. He constructed a ball made mainly of the metals I have just mentioned, and which perfectly represented our globe. When a fine dew was dropped onto its surface, it blistered, oxidized, and produced a tiny mountain. A crater opened at the summit, an eruption took place, and it transmitted so much warmth to the whole ball that it became too hot to hold. To tell the truth, I was beginning to be disturbed by the professor's arguments. What didn't help either was that he was presenting them with his usual verve and enthusiasm. You see, Axel, the state of the central core has produced various hypotheses amongst geologists. Nothing is less proven than the idea of an internal heat. In my view, it does not exist, could not possibly exist. In any case, we shall see for ourselves and, like Arne Saknussemm, discover where we stand on this important question. Yes, we shall. I shouted, won over by his excitement. We'll see for ourselves, provided, that is, anything at all can be seen down there. And why not? Can we not count on electrical phenomena to light the way, and even on the atmosphere, which the pressure may make more and more luminous as the center approaches? Yes. Yes. It is possible after all. It is certain, retorted my uncle in triumph. But it must be kept quiet, do you hear? All this must be maintained totally secret so that no one else has the idea of discovering the center of the Earth before us. 7-hour memorable session ended here. The discussion had given me a fever. I left my uncle's study as if in a trance. There was not enough air to calm me down in all the streets of Hamburg put together. So I made for the banks of the Elbe, near the steamboat service connecting the town with the Harburg railway line. Was I really convinced by what I'd just been told? Hadn't I been won over by Professor Leidenbrock's forceful manner? Could I take seriously his decision to go to the core of the terrestrial mass? Had I just heard the senseless speculations of a lunatic or the scientific analyses of a great genius? In all this, where did the truth end and illusion begin? I drifted amongst 1,000 contradictory hypotheses, without being able to seize hold of any of them. However, I did remember being convinced, although my enthusiasm was now beginning to wane, I would in fact have preferred to set off immediately so as not to have time to think. Yes, I would easily have been able to pack my cases at that very moment. Yet I have to confess that an hour later my excitement had subsided, my nerves grew less tense and, from the deep chasms of the earth, I slowly came back to the surface. It's all preposterous, I exclaimed, completely devoid of common sense. It's not the sort of proposal to put to a sensible boy. None of all that exists. I didn't sleep properly. I must have had a bad dream. I had meanwhile walked along the banks of the Elbe and reached the other side of the town. I had worked my way along the port and arrived at the Altona road. Inspiration had guided me, a justified intuition, for soon I caught sight of my little Grauben walking nimbly back to Hamburg. Grauben! I shouted from afar. The girl stopped, a little flustered, I imagine, to hear her name called on the public highway. 10 strides took me to her side. Axel, she said in surprise. Oh, so you came to meet me, you can't deny it. But when she looked at me, Grauben could not avoid noticing my worried, upset appearance. What's wrong? She said, taking my hand. Wrong, I cried. In 2 seconds and 3 sentences my pretty Verland girl was up to date on everything. She remained silent for a few seconds. Was her heart pounding as hard as mine? I don't know, but the hand holding mine wasn't trembling. We continued for 100 yards without a word. Axel, she said at last. Darling Grauben. It'll be a wonderful journey. I jumped a mile. Yes, Axel. A journey worthy of a scholar's nephew. A man should try to prove himself by some great adventure. What, Grauben, you're not attempting to stop me going on such an expedition? No, dear Axel, and I would gladly go with you and your uncle, but a poor girl would only be in the way. Are you telling the truth? Yes. Oh women, girls, feminine hearts, impossible to understand. When you are not the shyest of creatures, you are the most foolhardy. Reason has no influence over you. What, this child was encouraging me to take part in such an expedition. She wouldn't have been afraid to do the journey herself. She wanted me to do it, although she loved me. I was put out and, I admit, a little ashamed. Grauben, I tried again. We'll see if you talk this way tomorrow. Tomorrow, dear Axel, I'll be the same as today. We continued on our way, holding hands but not saying anything. I was exhausted by the day's events. After all, I thought the calends of July are still ages off, and before then any number of things can occur to cure my uncle of his craze for underground travel. Night had fallen by the time we got home to Königstrasse. I expected to find the house quiet, with my uncle in bed as usual and Martha giving the dining room one last feather dusting. But I had forgotten about the professor's impatience. I found him shouting and rushing round in the middle of a troop of porters, all unloading goods on the garden path, with the old servant at her wit's end. "Come on, Axel, don't hang around like a drip," shouted my uncle from afar as soon as he saw me. "Your trunk is not packed, my papers are not in order, I have lost the key for the traveling bag, and my gaiters have not yet arrived." I was overwhelmed, I couldn't find my voice. All my lips managed to produce was, "So we're leaving." "Yes, my poor boy. You should be moving instead of just standing there." "Really leaving?" I repeated faintly. "Day after tomorrow, crack of dawn." I couldn't bear to hear any more, and ran up to my little room. There could no longer be any doubt. During the afternoon my uncle had been buying the articles and utensils needed for his journey. The path was blocked with rope ladders, knotted cords, torches, water bottles, iron crampons, pickaxes, ice picks, alpenstocks, the total needing at least 10 men to carry it. I spent an awful night. In the morning I was called early. I decided not to open the door. But how could I resist a gentle voice saying, "Dear Axel"? I came out. I thought that my disheveled appearance, my pale face, my eyes reddened by lack of sleep, would affect Graubin and make her change her mind. "So, darling Axel, I see you're in better form, and have calmed down during the night." Calmed down. I rushed to the mirror. To my surprise I looked less bad than I'd thought. It was unbelievable. "Axel," said Graubin, "I've had a long talk with my guardian. He is a staunch scholar, a man of great courage, and you should always remember that you have his blood in your veins. He told me of his aims, his hopes, why he wants to achieve his goal, and how he's planning to go about it. He will get there, I'm sure. Dear Axel, it's such a fine thing to devote oneself to science. How famous Herr Leidenbrock will become, and his companion too. When you come back, Axel, you will be a man, his equal, free to speak, free to act, free at last too." The girl, turning red, could not finish. Her words gave me new energy. But I still couldn't believe that we were about to leave. I dragged Graubin into the professor's study. "So, uncle," I said, "are you really determined to go? What, aren't you convinced?" "Of course I am," I said to pacify him. "But I'm just wondering what all the hurry is." Time is the hurry. Time fleeing with a speed nothing can alter. But it is only the 26th of May, and the end of June is. So you think, ignoramus, that it is as easy as that to get to Iceland? If you had not left like a madman, I would have taken you with me to the branch office of Liffender & Co., of Copenhagen. There you would have seen that there is only one service from Copenhagen to Reykjavik, on the 22nd of each month. Well then, if we waited until the 22nd of June, we would arrive too late to see the shadow of Skartaris playing along the crater of Snæfell. We have to get to Copenhagen as quickly as possible and try to find some means of transport there. Go and pack your trunk." There was nothing more I could say. I went back up to my room. Graubin came with me. She immediately took charge, carefully packing into a small suitcase the things needed for my journey. She was no more excited than if it had been a day trip to Lübeck or Heligoland. Her little hands went back and forth unhurriedly. She talked calmly, she gave me the most sensible reasons for doing our expedition. She beguiled me and I felt very angry with her. At times I wanted to fly into a passion, but she took no notice and continued her calm and methodical work. Finally the last strap had been tightened round the case. I went downstairs again. Throughout the day, more and more suppliers of scientific instruments, firearms, and electrical apparatus arrived. Martha was in a terrible tizzy. "Is Sir mad?" she cried. I nodded. "And he's taking you with him?" Another nod. "Where?" I pointed to the center of the earth. "To the cellar." "No, further." Evening came. I was no longer aware of the passing of time. "See you tomorrow then," said my uncle. Departure, 6 sharp. At 10 o'clock I fell on my bed a lifeless mass. During the night terror took hold of me again. I spent it dreaming of chasms. I was the creature of delirium. I felt myself seized by the vigorous hand of the professor, dragged along, engulfed, bogged down. I was falling to the bottom of unfathomable pits with the increasing speed of bodies abandoned in space. My life was just one endless fall. I woke at 5, broken with fatigue and fear. I went down to the dining room. My uncle was at table. He was wolfing food down. I looked at him with horror. But Graubin was there, so I didn't say anything. But I couldn't eat. At 5:30, wheels were heard rumbling in the street. A large carriage arrived to take us to Altona station. It was soon piled up with my uncle's packages. "But where's your trunk?" "Everything's ready," I replied, my knees weakening. "Hurry up and bring it down or we'll miss the train." Fighting against destiny seemed impossible for the moment. Going up to my room, I let my case slide downstairs, rushing headlong down after it. Meanwhile, my uncle was solemnly putting the reins of the house in Grauben's hands. My pretty Verland girl was as calm as usual. She kissed her guardian, but she could not hold back a tear when she grazed my cheek with her sweet lips. Grauben, I said. Go, dear Axel, go. You are leaving a fiancé, but you will come back to a wife. I held Grauben briefly in my arms, then got into the carriage. She and Martha waved us a last goodbye from the front door. Then the two of us, urged on by the whistling of the driver, galloped off towards Altona. In less than 20 minutes, we had crossed the border into Holstein province. 36 Altona, really a suburb of Hamburg, is the terminus of the line from Kiel, along which we were due to travel to the coast of the Belts. At 6:30 the carriage pulled up in front of the station. My uncle's numerous packages and bulky cases were unloaded, carried in, weighed, labeled, and loaded into the luggage van. At 7 o'clock we were sitting opposite each other in our compartment. The steam whistle blew and the locomotive moved off. We had left. Was I resigned to my fate? No, not yet. But the fresh morning air and the view constantly changing with the motion of the train soon took my mind off its main worry. The professor's thoughts were obviously flying ahead of the train, moving too slowly for his impatience. We were alone in the carriage but did not speak. My uncle checked his pockets and traveling bag with the most painstaking care. I could see that not one of the items needed for carrying out his projects was missing. 36 Holstein Province, Denmark and Prussia fought a war in 1864, resulting in Schleswig-Holstein's incorporation into Prussia. It was quite remarkable to publish a book about two Germans visiting Denmark and one of its colonies when a war was going on between the two countries. Amongst them was a carefully folded sheet of headed notepaper from the Danish consulate, signed by Mr. Christiansen, Consul General in Hamburg and a friend of the professor's. It was intended to afford us every facility in Copenhagen with a view to being granted recommendations to the Governor-General of Iceland. I also glimpsed the famous document, carefully hidden away in the most secret compartment of my uncle's wallet. Still cursing it from the bottom of my heart, I began to examine the countryside. It was an endless succession of plains, lacking in interest, monotonous and silty, but relatively fertile and highly suitable for laying down a railway, given its potential for those straight lines so popular with the rail companies. But the tedium did not have time to annoy me, for, only 3 hours after leaving, the train stopped at Kiel, a stone's throw from the sea. Since our luggage was registered for Copenhagen, we had no need to bother with it. Nevertheless, the professor watched with an anxious expression as it was loaded onto the steamship. Then it disappeared into the bottom of a hold. In his hurry, my uncle had so carefully calculated the connections between the train and the steamer that we had nearly a whole day to kill, for the Eleonora was not due to leave until after nightfall. Hence a fever lasting 9 hours, during which the cantankerous traveler rained curses on the shipping and railway companies and governments which allowed such abuses to happen. I was forced to back him up while he berated the captain of the Eleonora on this very subject. He wanted to make him stoke the boilers without wasting a moment. The captain advised him to go for a walk. In Kiel, as elsewhere, a day has to pass, eventually. By dint of walking along the luxuriant banks of the bay leading to the town, by trampling through the bushy woods which make the town look like a nest amidst a network of branches, by admiring the bungalows each with its own little cold bath house, and by rushing and cursing, we somehow managed to reach 10 in the evening. The whirls of smoke rose from the Eleonora into the sky, the deck trembled with the shivers issuing from the boiler. We had already embarked, the proud occupants of 2 superimposed berths in the only Passenger cabin on board. At 10:15 the moorings were cast off, and the steamer moved rapidly over the dark waters of the Store Belt. It was a black night, there came a fine breeze and a strong sea, a few lights from shore perforated the darkness. Later, a flashing lighthouse shone briefly over the waves from some mysterious point, and that is all I can remember of our first crossing. At 7 a.m. we disembarked at Corser, a little town on the west coast of Zealand. There we quickly climbed into another train, which carried us over a countryside just as flat as the Holstein one. It still took 3 more hours to reach the capital of Denmark. My uncle hadn't shut his eyes all night. In his impatience, I think he was even pushing the carriage along with his feet. Finally, he caught sight of an arm of the sea. The sound! He shouted. On our left was a vast construction like a hospital. "A lunatic asylum," said one of our traveling companions. Well, I thought there's one establishment where we ought to end our days. And however big it is, that hospital would still be too small for all the professor's folly. At 10 a.m., we finally alighted in Copenhagen. The luggage was loaded onto a cab and driven with us to the Phoenix Hotel in Bredgade, talking half an hour, for the station is out of town. Then, after a quick wash, my uncle dragged me out of my room. The hotel porter spoke German and English, but the professor, playing the polyglot, questioned him in good Danish, and it was in good Danish that we were told where the museum of northern antiquities was. This curious establishment contained stacks of marvels, allowing one to reconstitute the country's history, with its old stone weapons, its goblets, and its jewels. Professor Thompson, the director, was a scholar and a friend of the consul in Hamburg. My uncle had a warm letter of recommendation to give him. Normally one scholar does not receive another very well at all. But here things were different. Professor Thompson, a man who liked to help, gave Prof. Sor Leidenbrock and even his nephew a kind welcome. To say that our secret was kept from the excellent director goes without saying. We wished simply to visit Iceland as disinterested amateurs. Professor Thompson put himself entirely at our disposal, and together we combed the quays looking for a ship about to sail. I had hoped that no means of transport would be available, but this was not to be. A little Danish schooner, the Valkyrie 37, was due to sail for Reykjavik on the 2nd of June. The captain, a Mr. Bjarne, was on board. His passenger, to be overjoyed, shook his hand hard enough to break it. This simple man was surprised by such a grip. He found it quite normal to go to Iceland, that was his job. But my uncle found it sublime. The worthy captain took advantage of his enthusiasm to make us pay double for the voyage. But we weren't bothered by such trifles. Be on board by 7 a.m. on Tuesday, said Mr. Bjarne, thrusting a wad of dollars into his pocket. We thanked Mr. Thompson for all his help and returned to the Phoenix Hotel. Everything's going well, very well indeed. My uncle kept saying. What a stroke of luck to have found that vessel ready to leave. Now let's eat and then we can visit the town. 37 Valkyrie, in Norse mythology, one of the maidens who served Odin and rode over the battlefields to select dead heroes and take them back to Valhalla, also an allusion to Wagner, whom Verne cites in several works. We headed for Kongens Nytorv, an irregularly shaped square with a plinth containing 2 innocent cannon which have taken aim but in fact frighten nobody. Just beside it, at number 5, there was a restaurant run by a French chef called Vincent. We ate our fill there for the modest price of 4 marks each. 38 Then I took a childish pleasure in exploring the town, with my uncle allowing himself to be dragged along. In any case he saw nothing, not the insignificant royal palace, nor the pretty 17th-century bridge across the canal in front of the museum, nor the huge memorial to Thorvaldsen, 39 covered in hideous murals and with the works of this sculptor inside, nor the candy box Rosenborg Castle, nor the admirable Renaissance building of the Stock Exchange, nor the church spire made of the intertwined tails of 4 bronze dragons, nor even the great windmills on the ramparts, whose immense wings swelled up like a ship's sails in a strong sea wind. What delightful walks we could have gone on, my lovely Verland girl and I, around the port where the double-deckers and frigates slept peacefully under their red roofs, along the lush shores of the strait, or through the bushy shade concealing the fortress, whose cannon push their black mouths between the branches of the elders and willows. But unfortunately my poor Graubin was far away. Did I have any hope of ever seeing her again? And yet, if my uncle noticed nothing of these enchanted sights, he was bowled over when he saw a certain church spire on the island of Amager, in the southeastern part of Copenhagen. I was instructed to head in that direction. We climbed onto a small steam-powered boat serving the canals and soon it pulled in at the quay known as the dockyard. Having made our way through narrow streets where convicts dressed in gray and yellow striped trousers were working under stick-wielding warders, we arrived at the Vor Frelsers Kirk. The church itself was not special in any way, but its high tower had caught the professor's eye. Starting from the platform, an outside staircase worked its way round the spire, with its spirals in the open air. Up we go, said my uncle. But what if we get giddy? All the more reason, we have to get used to it. All the same. Come on, I tell you, we're wasting time. There was no choice but to obey. A caretaker who lived on the other side of the street gave us the key, and our ascent began. My uncle went first, treading firmly. I followed with great trepidation, as my head turned deplorably easily. I had neither the eagle's sense of balance nor its steady nerves. 38 About 2 francs 75 centime, author's note. JV 39 Thorvaldsen, Bertel, 1770-1844, of Icelandic descent. As long as we were imprisoned in the staircase inside the tower everything went well. But after 150 spiral steps the air suddenly hit me in the face. We had arrived on the platform. This was where the open-air staircase began, protected by a thin rail, with the steps getting ever narrower, apparently climbing up to infinity. I can't. You are not a coward, are you? Start climbing, replied the pitiless professor. The only option was to follow, hanging firmly on. The open air made my head turn. I could feel the tower swaying in the gusts of wind. My legs began to give way. Soon I was climbing on my knees, then on my stomach. I closed my eyes, feeling space sickness. At last, with my uncle pulling me up by the collar, I arrived near the ball. Look, he said, and look properly. You need to take lessons in precipices. I opened my eyes. Through the smoky mist I caught sight of houses without any depth, as if crushed by a great fall. Above my head passed disheveled clouds which by some optical illusion seemed to have become stationary while the tower, the ball, and I were being carried away at an incredible speed. In the distance, the green countryside stretched out on one side, while on the other the sea sparkled under a sheaf of rays of sunlight. The Sound unwound to the point of Elsinore, speckled with a few white sails exactly like seagulls' wings, and in the mist to the east rolled the coast of Sweden, only slightly smudged. This huge expanse swirled every time I looked at it. Nevertheless I had to get up, stand straight up, and look. My first less sun and dizziness lasted an hour. When at last I was allowed down and could set foot again on the firm paving of the streets, I was aching all over. We'll do the same tomorrow, announced my teacher. In fact, I practiced this dizzy-making exercise each day for 5 days. Whether I liked it or not, I made noticeable progress in the art of contemplation from high places. 9. The time came when we were due to leave. The day before, the obliging Mr. Thompson had brought the warmest letters of recommendation for Count Tramp, the governor of Iceland, Mr. Pettersson, the bishop's coadjutor, and Mr. Finson, the mayor of Reykjavik. In return my uncle granted him his heartiest handshake. At 6 a.m. on the 2nd our precious luggage was already stowed on board the Valkyrie. The captain led us down to cabins that were rather narrow and situated under a sort of deck house. Is the wind with us? Inquired my uncle. Perfectly, replied Captain Bjarne. From the southeast. We can leave the Sound with the wind on the quarter and all sails set. A few moments later, the schooner, with lower foresail, brigantine, topsail, and mizzen topgallant sail unfurled, cast off and sailed full speed into the strait. An hour later the capital of Denmark sank below the distant waves as the Valkyrie cut past the coast of Elsinore. In the state of nerves I was in, I half expected to see Hamlet's shadow stalking along the legendary terrace. 40, sublime dreamer, I said. You'd probably have given us your blessing. You might even have wanted to come with us to the center of the globe to seek a solution to your eternal doubt. But nothing appeared on the aged ramparts. In any case, the castle is much younger than the heroic Prince of Denmark. It serves now as a luxurious lodge for the watchmen of this Strait of the Sound, through which 15,000 ships of all nations pass each year. Kronoberg Castle soon disappeared into the mist, as did Helsingborg Tower on the Swedish coast. The schooner leaned over slightly in the breeze from the Kattegat. The Valkyrie was a fine sailing ship, but with sails you never know exactly what to expect. She was transporting coal, household utensils, pottery, woolen clothing, and a cargo of wheat to Reykjavik. 5 crew members, all Danish, were enough to man her. How long will the voyage take? Asked my uncle. About 10 days, if we don't have too many nor'westers windward of the Faroes. But you don't normally encounter significant delays. No, Professor Leidenbrock. Don't worry, we'll get there. Towards evening the schooner rounded Cape Skagen, the northernmost point of Denmark, then during the night crossed the Skagerrak, cut across the tip of Norway opposite Cape Lindanes and ventured into the North Sea. 2 days later, we sighted the coast of Scotland in the region of Paterhead, and the Valkyrie headed towards the Faroe Islands, passing between the Orkneys and the Shetlands. Soon our schooner was lashed by the waves of the Atlantic, she had to tack against the north wind, and reached the Faroes only with some difficulty. On the 8th, the captain caught sight of Mykines, the easternmost of the Faroes, 41, and from that moment on headed straight for Portland Point, on the southern coast of Iceland. 40 Hamlet's shadow stalking along the legendary terrace. Even Hamlet seems to be a source for the decidedly all-englobing Verne, including also the theme of madness, the cemetery, the skull, Elsinore, and the quotation, that is the question, ch. 33. Hamlet was drawn from ancient Scandinavian legend, and ultimately from Iceland, where the story feature in many different sagas and stories. 41 Mykines, the westernmost of the Faroes, Verne, Myganus, La plus Orion Tale, de Faroe. The crossing did not involve any special incident. I resisted seasickness quite well, whereas my uncle, to his great annoyance and even greater shame, was ill all the time. As a result, he was unable to raise the subject of Snaefels with Captain Bjarne, or the availability of means of communication and transport. He had to put off these questions until he arrived, and spent all his time lying in the cabin, whose walls creaked whenever the ship rolled. It must be admitted that he had to a certain degree deserved his fate. On the 11th, we sighted Cape Portland. The weather, clear at this point, allowed us to see Myrtle's Jokul standing up behind the cape, which consists of a large steep-sided hill solitarily washed up on the beach. The Valkyrie kept a reasonable distance from the coast, working its way round towards the west while encircled by numerous schools of whales and sharks. Soon there appeared a huge outcrop with daylight showing through a hole where the foaming sea furiously surged. The Westman Islands looked as if they had emerged directly from the ocean, like rocks planted in the liquid plains. From this point on the schooner kept well out so as to leave a wide berth while rounding Cape Reykjanes, which forms the western corner of Iceland. The sea was very rough, stopping my uncle from coming on deck to admire the shattered coasts lashed by the southwesterly wind. 48 hours later, after leaving behind a storm which had forced the schooner to run with all sails furled, we sighted to the east the beacon of Point Skagen, 42, whose dangerous rocks extend a long way out under the waves. An Icelandic pilot came on board, and 3 hours later the Valkyrie dropped anchor in Faxa Bay, beside Reykjavik itself. The professor finally came out of his cabin, a little pale, a little shaky, but still enthusiastic and with a gleam of satisfaction in his eye. The population of the town, enthralled by the arrival of a ship in which each expected something, congregated on the quayside. My uncle was in a hurry to flee his floating prison cum hospital. But before leaving the deck of the schooner, he dragged me forward. There, near the northern part of the bay, stood a high mountain with 2 points on top, a double cone covered with perpetual snows. Snaefels, he roared. Snaefels. He made a sign indicating total secrecy, and then climbed down into the waiting boat. Soon we were standing on the soil of Iceland itself. The first man to appear had a pleasant countenance and a general's uniform. He was, however, a mere civilian, the governor of the island, Baron Tramp himself. The professor realized who he was dealing with. He presented the governor with the letters from Copenhagen and launched into a short conversation in Danish, which I took no part in at all, for a very good reason. But the result of this first interview was that Baron Tramp put himself entirely at Professor Leidenbrock's disposal. 42 Point Skagen, no trace of this point seems to exist. Verne may have taken the name from Cape Skagen in Denmark, mentioned 2 pages previously. My uncle also received a warm welcome from the mayor, Mr. Finson, whose uniform was no less military than the governor's but whose temperament and function were just as peaceful. As for the coadjutor, Mr. Petcherson, he was at present carrying out an episcopal visit to the northern diocese, so we had to postpone being introduced to him. But a charming citizen, whose help became extremely precious, was Mr. Fridriksson, who taught science at Reykjavik School. This humble scholar spoke only Icelandic and Latin. He came and offered his services in the language of Horace, and I felt that we were bound to understand each other. He was in fact the only person I could converse with during my entire stay in Iceland. Of the 3 rooms making up his household, this excellent man put 2 at our disposal, and soon we were ensconced there with our luggage, whose quantity slightly surprised the inhabitants of Reykjavik. Well, Axel, said my uncle, things are working out. We are over the worst. What do you mean, the worst? I mean it's downhill all the way. In that sense, you're right, but, having gone down, won't we eventually have to come back up? Oh, that will not present a problem. Look, there is no time to be lost. I am going to visit the library. It might contain some manuscript of Saknussems, and if so I would very much like to have a look at it. Well then, during that time I'll visit the town. Aren't you going to have a look yourself? To tell the truth, I am not very much drawn by all that. What is interesting in this country of Iceland is below the ground, not above. I went out, and walked around at random. To get lost in the 2 streets of Reykjavik would have been difficult. I did not therefore have to ask my way, which can cause problems in sign language. The town stretches out over rather low and marshy ground between 2 hills. A huge lava bed protects it on one side as it descends in gentle stages towards the sea. On the other stretches the vast Faxa Bay, encircled to the north by the huge glacier of Snaefels, and where the Valkyrie lay at anchor, alone for the moment. Normally, the British and French fish patrols remain at anchor further out, but at this period they were working on the eastern coastline of the island. The longer of Reykjavik's streets runs parallel to the shore. This is where the shopkeepers and tradesmen work, in log cabins made of horizontal red beams. The shorter street, lying further to the west, heads towards a little lake passing between the houses of the bishop and other notables not in trade. I had soon finished my tour of these bleak, depressing avenues. From time to time I caught sight of a scrap of faded lawn, like an old woolen carpet threadbare through use, or else some semblance of an orchard. Its rare produce, cabbages and lettuces, would not have seemed out of place on a table in Lilliput. A few sickly wallflowers endeavored to look as though taking the sun. Not far from the middle of the residential street, I found the public cemetery, enclosed by an earthen wall and with plenty of room left inside. Then, only a few yards away, the governor's house, a farmhouse in comparison with Hamburg town hall, but a palace beside the huts of the Icelandic population. Between the little lake and the town lay the church, in the Protestant style, built out of calcined rocks generously provided by the volcanoes themselves. During the strong westerly winds, the red tiles of its roof clearly had a habit of flying into the air, to the considerable danger of the congregation. 43 On a nearby hillock, I discovered the national school where, as our host later told me, Hebrew, English, French, and Danish were taught, 4 languages of which, to my shame, I knew not a single word. I would have been the last amongst the 40 pupils at this tiny school, and unworthy to sleep with them in those 2-compartment cabinets where more sensitive souls might easily have suffocated on the very first night. In 3 hours, I had visited not only the town but even its surroundings. Their appearance was especially dismal. No trees, no vegetation to speak of. Everywhere the bare bones of the volcanic rocks. The Icelandic habitations are made of earth and peat, and their walls slope inwards. They look like roofs placed on the ground, except that the roofs themselves constitute relatively fertile fields. Thanks to the heat from the houses, grass grows here in abundance. It is carefully cut at haymaking time, for otherwise the animals from the houses would come and gently graze on these lush cottages. During my excursion, I encountered few locals. When I got back to the street containing the shops, I found most of the population busy drying, salting, and loading cod, the main export. The men seemed robust but heavy, like blonde Germans with pensive eyes. They must feel slightly outcast from humanity, exiles on this frozen land, whom nature should really have made Eskimos when she condemned them to live on the Arctic Circle Clee. I tried in vain to surprise a smile on their faces. They sometimes laughed in a sort of involuntary contraction of the muscles, but never actually smiled. Their clothing consisted of a coarse jumper of the black wool known in Scandinavian countries as vadmal, 44, a hat with a very broad rim, a pair of trousers with red piping, and a piece of folded leather in the way of shoes. The women wore sad, resigned faces, of a fairly pleasant type but rather expressionless, and were dressed in a bodice and skirt of dark vadmal. Unmarried girls wore a small brown knitted bonnet on their hair, which was plaited into garlands. Married women, a colored kerchief around their head, with a crest of white linen on top. 43 Danger of the congregation. As early as 1810, travelers reported on the faulty state of the roof tiles in this church. 44 Vadmal, literally, homespun. After a good walk I returned to Mr. Fridrikson's house. My uncle was already there, together with his host. Dinner was ready and was devoured with great gusto by Professor Liedenbrock, whose stomach had become a deep chasm during the forced abstinence on board. The meal, more Danish than Icelandic, involved nothing remarkable in itself, but our host, more Icelandic than Danish, reminded me of the heroes of classical hospitality. It was clear that we were more part of his household than the man himself. Conversation used the native tongue, interspersed for my sake with German by my uncle and Latin by Mr. Fridriksson. It concerned scientific subjects, as is appropriate for scholars, but Professor Leidenbrock maintained a very strict reserve, and at each sentence his eyes told me to keep a total silence about our future plans. First, Mr. Fridriksson questioned my uncle about the results of his research in the library. Your library. It consists of lonely books on almost deserted shelves. What? We have 8,000 volumes, many of which are valuable and rare, including works in Old Scandinavian, plus all the new books that Copenhagen sends us each year. Where do you keep those 8,000 volumes? For my part, Professor Leidenbrock, they're all over the country. We enjoy studying in our frozen old land. Every farmer, every fisherman knows how to read, and does read. We believe that books, instead of moldering behind bars, far from interested examination, are meant to be worn out by readers' eyes. So these books are passed from person to person, looked at, read and reread, and often do not come back to the shelves for a year or two. And in the meantime, replied my uncle with some annoyance, poor foreigners. It cannot be helped. Foreigners have their own libraries at home and, above all, our farm laborers need to educate themselves. As I have mentioned, the love of study is in the Icelandic blood. Thus in 1816 we founded a literary society which is still thriving. Foreign scholars are honored to become members. It publishes books for the enlightenment of our fellow citizens, and performs a real service for the country. If you wished to be one of its corresponding members, Professor Leidenbrock, we would be delighted. My uncle, who already belonged to 100 or so scientific societies, accepted with good grace, which greatly pleased Mr. Fridriksson. Now, said he, kindly indicate the books you hope to find in our library, and I can perhaps provide some information on them. I looked at my uncle. He could not decide whether or not to reply. This matter concerned his projects directly. However, after thinking for a while, he decided to speak out. Mr. Fridriksson, I wish to know whether you have, amongst the oldest works, those of a certain Arne Saknussemm. Arne Saknussemm. You are referring to that scholar of the 16th century who was a great naturalist, a great alchemist, and a great traveler. Precisely. One of the stars of Icelandic literature and science. As you so well put it. One of the most illustrious of men. Most certainly. And whose courage was as great as his genius. I see you know him perfectly. My uncle was in ecstasy to hear his hero spoken of in this way. He was devouring Mr. Fridriksson with his eyes. Well, he asked, what about his works? His works, we do not have. What, even in Iceland? They do not exist, in Iceland or anywhere else. And why ever not? Because Arne Saknussemm was persecuted for heresy, and his works were burned in Copenhagen in 1573 by the hand of the executioner. Good. Splendid. Shouted my uncle, greatly shocking the science teacher. Yes, everything is explained, everything fits together, all is clear, and now I understand why Saknussemm, having been put on the index and forced to hide the discoveries of his genius, had to conceal the secret in an incomprehensible word puzzle. What secret? Inquired Mr. Fridriksson keenly. A secret that, by means of which, spluttered my uncle. Do you by any chance have some special document? No. I was making a pure supposition. Fine, replied Mr. Fridriksson, who had observed my uncle's confusion and was kind enough not to insist. I hope, he added, that you will not leave our island without delving into its mineral riches. Certainly, but perhaps I arrive a little late in the day. Have any scholars been through here already? Yes, Professor Leidenbrock, the work of Olafsson and Pavelson, carried out by order of the king, Troyle studies, Gaimard and Robert's scientific mission on board the French corvette Le Recherche, 4546 and recently the observations of scholars on the frigate 45 Le Recherche was sent by Admiral Duper in 1835 to find the traces of a lost expedition, that of M. de Blossevel and Le Lillois, of which no trace has ever been found. J.V. 46 Olafsson, Egert Olafsson, who carried out a comprehensive field survey of the country and people of Iceland published in Danish in 1772, Pavelson, pseudonym of Bjarni Palsson, 1719-79, author of De Vice Lavmans, Island Lorraine Hortense, have all contributed very considerably to our knowledge of Iceland. But believe me, there are still things to be done. Do you really think so? Said my uncle a shade naively, trying to make his eyes shine less. Yes. How many mountains, glaciers, volcanoes there are to be still hardly explored. Look, without going any further, consider that mountain on the horizon. It is called Snæfell's. Is it indeed? Snæfell's. Yes, a most unusual volcano, whose crater is rarely visited. Extinct. Oh yes. Extinct for the last 500 years. Well, replied my uncle, frantically crossing and uncrossing his legs so as not to jump into the air. I feel like beginning my geological studies with this Snæfell. Fellas, what did you call it? Snæfells, repeated the excellent Mr. Fridriksson. This part of the conversation took place in Latin. I had followed everything, hardly able to keep a straight face when I saw my uncle trying to keep his satisfaction in, flowing as it was from every pore. He was trying to put on an innocent air, which made him look like a grimacing old devil. Yes, he said, your words have made up my mind. We will try and climb this Snæfells, perhaps even study its crater. I very much regret that my duties do not allow me to leave Reykjavik. I would willingly have accompanied you with pleasure and profit. No, quickly replied my uncle. We wish to disturb nobody, Mr. Fridriksson. I thank you with all my heart. To have a scholar like you with us would have been very useful, but your professional duties. I like to think that our host, in the innocence of his Icelandic soul, did not suspect my uncle's blatant tricks. It seems a very good idea, Professor Leidenbrock, to begin with this volcano. You will make many interesting observations there. But tell me, how are you planning to reach the Snæfells Peninsula? By sea, crossing the bay. It is the quickest route. No doubt, but it cannot be taken. Copenhagen, 1774-5, translated as Voyage in Iceland. 1802, Troyle stud IEs, Verne, Troyle, Uno von Troyle, Bishop of Linköping then Archbishop of Uppsala, author of Bref Rerard and Resa till Island MDCCLXXII, Uppsala, 1777, translated as Letters on Iceland, 1780, Gaimard, Joseph Paul, 1790-1858, French naturalist, directed scientific expeditions to Northern Europe, 1835-6, 1838-40, author of Voyage in Iceland at Groenland, document, exécuté pendant les années 1835 et 1836 sur la corvette, la recherche, dans le but de découvrir les traces de l'Illois, Robert, Louis, Eugene, 1806-79, collaborated on Gaimard's book, Duperrey, Victor Guy, 1775-1846, Minister for the Navy, Bloseville, Jules A. R. P. 1802-33, French navigator, disappeared off east coast of Greenland. Reine Hortense, Verne is here indirectly alluding to one of his major sources, Charles Edmond, pseudonym of Edmond Chejecki, collaborated with Adolphe d'Hennery on many plays, who himself collaborated very extensively with Verne. Voyage dans les mers du Nord b bord de la corvette La Reine Hortense, which contains a map of his journey and a geological map of Iceland, 1857. Why not? Because we do not have a single small boat in Reykjavik. My God. You will have to go by land, following the coast. It will take longer, but be more interesting. Good. I will see to obtaining a guide. As a matter of fact, I have one to offer you. Who is reliable and intelligent. Yes, he lives on the peninsula. He is an eider hunter, highly skilled, and with whom you will be pleased. He speaks perfect Danish. And when can I see him? Tomorrow if you wish. Why not today? Because he will only be here tomorrow. Tomorrow then, my uncle replied with a sigh. This decisive conversation finished a few moments later with warm thanks from the German scholar to his Icelandic counterpart. During the dinner, my uncle had gathered some vital information, including the story of Saknussemm, the reason for his mysterious document, the fact that his host would not be accompanying him on the expedition, and the news that a guide would be at his orders the very next day. 11 in the evening, I went for a brief walk along the seafront of Reykjavik, came back early, then retired to my bed of rough planks, where I slept the sleep of the just. On waking up, I heard my uncle talking volubly in the next room. I quickly got up and joined him. He was speaking Danish with a tall man, robustly built. This great strapping figure was clearly of unusual strength. His eyes, in a head of very considerable size and a certain naivety, appeared intelligent to me. They were of a dreamy blue color. Long hair, which would have passed for red even in Britain, fell on athletic shoulders. This native was supple in his movements, but moved his arms little, like a man who didn't know the language of gestures or didn't bother to use it. Everything about him revealed a perfectly calm nature, not lazy, but composed. You felt that he didn't require anything from anyone, that he worked as it suited him, that his philosophy of life couldn't be astonished or disturbed by anything in this world. I was able to detect the nuances of the Icelander's character by the way he listened to the passionate flow of words addressed to him. He remained with his arms crossed, not moving despite my uncle's repeated gesticulations, to say no, his head turned from left to right to say yes, downwards, but so little that his long hair hardly moved. He was not so much economical with his movements as tight-fisted. Certainly, looking at this man, I would never have guessed that he was a hunter. He wouldn't frighten the game, for sure, but how could he possibly get near it? Everything became clear when Mr. Fridriksson reminded me that this calm person was only a hunter of eider, a bird whose plumage constitutes the main resource of the island. Called eider down, you do not need to move a great deal to collect it. During the first days of summer, the female eider, a kind of prettified duck, goes and builds her nest amongst the rocks of the fjords 47 which fringe the coast. The nest built, she carpets it with fine feathers that she tears from her stomach. Straightway the hunter, or rather merchant, arrives, takes the nest, and the female starts her work again. This continues as long as she has any down left. When she is completely bare, it is the male's turn to contribute his. But as the hard, rough feathers of the male have no commercial value, the hunter does not bother to steal the future brood's bed. So the nest is completed, the female lays her eggs, the bob-eyes hatch, and, the following year, the hunting of the eider down starts again. However, since the eider does not choose steep rocks to build her nest on, but easy, horizontal ones sloping down into the sea, the Icelandic hunter can practice his profession without too much commotion. He is a farmer who doesn't have to sow the seed or cut his harvest, but merely gather it in. This serious, phlegmatic, silent type was called Hans Bjelke, and he came with Mr. Fridriksson's recommendations. He was our future guide, and his manner contrasted singularly with my uncle's. Nevertheless, they got on well from the start. Neither of them discussed prices, the one was ready to accept whatever was offered, the other to pay whatever was asked. Never was a deal easier to reach. According to their agreement, Hans undertook to guide us to the village of Stupé, on the southern coast of the Snæfell's Peninsula and at the very foot of the volcano. The distance by land was about 22 miles, or 2 days' journey according to my uncle's reckoning. But when he learned that these were Danish miles, of 24,000 feet apiece, he had to adjust his calculations, and plan on 7 or 8 days' travel, given the poor quality of the tracks. 4 horses were to be put at our disposal, 2 for riding and 2 for luggage. Hans would travel on foot, which he was used to. He knew this part of the coast like the back of his hand, and promised to take us by the shortest route. His contract with my uncle did not expire when we arrived at Stepi. He remained in his service for the total time necessary for his scientific excursions, at the price of 3 rix dollars per week. 48 It was expressly agreed that this sum would be paid to the guide each Saturday evening, failing which his contract would be null and void. 47 The name given to the long narrow inlets in Scandinavian countries. JV 48 16 francs 98 centimes. JV, it was decided we would leave on the 16th of June. My uncle wanted to give the hunter an advance on the agreement, but was rebuffed with a single word. After. 49, after, said the professor for my edification. Once the agreement had been reached, the hunter promptly left. He's perfect, exclaimed my uncle. But he can hardly realize the brilliant part he is going to play. So he's coming with us. To the center of the earth. There were still 48 hours left, but, to my great regret, I had to devote them to the preparations. All our intelligence was employed organizing things in the most useful way, the instruments here, the firearms there, the tools in this package, the food in that. 4 groups in all. The instruments included, 1. A centigrade thermometer made by Eigel, graduated to 150 degrees, which didn't seem quite right to me. Too much if the temperature went up as far as that, since we would be cooked. But not enough to measure the temperature of hot springs or other molten substances. 2. A manometer operated by compressed air, designed to show pressures greater than that at sea level. An ordinary barometer would not have been sufficient, given that the atmospheric pressure was due to increase proportionally with our descent underground. 3. A chronometer by Boysones Jr. of Geneva, perfectly set to the Hamburg meridian. 4. 2 compasses to measure positive and negative inclination. 5. A night glass. 6. 2 Ruhmkorff 50 lamps which used an electric current to give a highly portable source of light, reliable and not too bulky. 5149, Efter, Icelandic, Eftir, Danish, Efter, Swedish, Efter. Hans's Danish is in fact mostly Swedish, unlike the rest of the Danish in the book, which is more or less authentic. 50 Ruhmkorff, Heinrich Daniel, 1803-77, born in Hanover, worked in Paris, invented miner's safety lamp. It was in fact in 1858 that he was awarded the 50,000 franc prize for the most important discovery in the application of electric ity, the induction coil in 1851. 51 The Ruhmkorff apparatus consists of a Bunsen battery, activated by means of potassium dichromate, which is odorless. An induction coil transmits the electricity produced by the battery to a lantern of a particular nature. In this lantern there is a glass coil under vacuum, in which there remains only a residue of CO2 and nitrogen. When the apparatus is in operation, this gas becomes luminous, producing a continuous white light. The battery and coil are placed in a leather bag that the traveler wears over one shoulder. The lantern, placed outside, provides more than sufficient light in total darkness. It allows one to venture without fear of explosion amongst the most inflammable gases, and does not go out even when immersed in the deepest rivers. Ruhmkorff is a learned and skillful physicist. His great discovery is that of the induction coil, which allows high-tension electricity to be produced. He has just obtained, in 1864, the prize. The arms consisted of 2 rifles from Pertoley Moore & Co., and 2 Colt revolvers. Why take them? I didn't imagine we were going to encounter all that many savages or wild beasts. But my uncle seemed very attached to his arsenal and his instruments, and especially to a considerable quantity of guncotton, which is unaffected by damp and whose explosive power is far greater than that of ordinary powder. The tools were 2 ice picks, 2 pickaxes, 1 ladder made of silk, 3 alpenstocks, 1 axe, 1 hammer, a dozen iron wedges and pythons, and several long knotted ropes. This could not help making a large packet, for the ladder alone was 300 feet in length. Finally there were the provisions. The parcel was not a big one, but was reassuring, for I knew that it contained 6 months' supply of dried meat and biscuits. Gin was the only liquid, with water totally absent. We had flasks, and my uncle counted on springs to fill them. The objections I raised as to their quality, temperature, and even existence were ignored. To complete our list of travel items, I will mention a portable medical kit containing blunt-bladed scissors, splints for fractures, a strip of Holland material, bandages and compresses, sticking plaster, a basin for bloodletting, terrifying objects in themselves, but in addition a whole series of bottles containing dextrin, surgical spirit, liquid acetate of lead, ether, vinegar, and ammonia, all drugs of a frightening nature, and finally the materials necessary for the Ruhmkorff lamps. My uncle was careful not to forget a supply of tobacco, powder for hunting, and tinder, nor a leather belt which he wore round his waist and which contained an adequate supply of money in gold, silver, and paper form. 6 stout pairs of shoes, waterproofed by means of a coating of tar and gutta percha, fell into the category of miscellaneous items. With such clothing, shoes, and equipment, there is no reason we shouldn't go far, declared my uncle. The 14th was entirely taken up with organizing the various items. In the evening we dined at Baron Tramp's, in the company of the mayor of Reykjavik and Dr. Hjalteline, the most distinguished physician in the country. Mr. Fredrickson was not amongst the guests. I learned later that the governor and he were in disagreement on an administrative matter and did not speak to each other. As a result, I didn't have the opportunity of understanding a single word of what was said during this semi-official dinner. I noticed only that my uncle spoke all the time. The following day, our preparations were finished. Our host delighted the professor by presenting him with a chart of Iceland which was incomparably better than Andersen's. It was the map drawn up by Mr. Olaf Nikolaus Olsson, on a scale of 1,480,000, published by the Icelandic Literary Society and based on Messrs. Scheel and Frizzek's geodesic work and Mr. Bjorn Gunnlaugson's topographical survey. It constituted a precious document for a mineralogist, of 50,000 francs that France awards every 5 years for the most ingenious application of electricity. JV, the last evening was spent in close conversation with Mr. Fredrickson, for whom I felt the warmest sympathy. After the talk came a rather agitated sleep, for me at least. At 5 o'clock, I was woken up by 4 horses whinnying and prancing directly below my window. I dressed quickly and went outside. Hans was finishing loading the luggage, almost without moving. He worked, however, with an unusual degree of skill. My uncle was producing more heat than light and the guide seemed to be taking very little notice of his recommendations. Everything was ready by 6. Mr. Fredrickson shook our hands. With a great deal of warmth and in Icelandic, my uncle thanked him for his kind hospitality. As for myself, I strung together a cordial farewell in my best Latin. Then we climbed into the saddles, and Mr. Fredrickson accompanied his final goodbye to me with that line from Virgil that seemed ready-made for us, uncertain travelers on the road. Et quicumque viam dederit fortuna sequamur. 5212. We left in overcast but settled weather. No exhausting heat to fear, no disastrous rain. Weather for tourists. The joy of riding through an unknown land made me easy to please at the beginning of our venture. I was caught up in the happiness of those who go on journeys, a feeling of hope mixed with a sense of freedom. I began to feel involved in the trip. In any case, what do I risk? Traveling through a fascinating country, going up a remarkable mountain, at worst climbing down an extinct crater. It's clear that that's all Saknussemm ever did. As for the existence of a tunnel leading straight to the center of the globe, pure fantasy, totally impossible. So let's get whatever good we can out of this expedition, and not quibble too much about the rest. By the time my thoughts had got this far, we had left Reykjavik. Hans walked in front, at a quick but regular and unchanging pace. The 2 horses with our luggage followed him without having to be led. My uncle and I came last, trying not to make too much of a sight of ourselves on our small but hardy mounts. Iceland is one of the biggest islands in Europe. Its surface stretches across 1,400 miles, but it has only 60,000 inhabitants. Geographers have divided it into 4 parts, and it was the region of the southwest quarter, Sudvesturfjordnagar, that we had to cross, almost diagonally. On leaving Reykjavik, Hans had immediately followed the seashore. We crossed thin pastures that made great efforts to be green, but yellow had more success. The rugged summits of the trachytic 53 hills faded away amongst the mists on the eastern horizon. From time to time, patches of 52 et quicumque viam dederit fortuna sequamur, and whatever route fortune gives, we shall follow. The Aeneid, Book 11, v. 128, 53 trachytic, volcanic rocks with a rough or gritty surface, snow, concentrating the diffuse light shown on the slopes of distant mountains. A few peaks, standing up more firmly, pointed through the gray clouds, to reappear above the shifting mists like bare reefs in an open sky. Often these chains of dry rocks pushed out towards the sea, eating into the pasture, but there was always room to get past. In any case, our horses instinctively chose the best route without ever slowing their pace. My uncle did not even have the consolation of using his voice or whip to urge his mount forward. He had no excuse to be impatient. I couldn't help smiling when I saw him so big on his little horse, for, with his long legs skimming the ground, he looked like a 6-legged centaur. Nice animal, he kept saying. You will see, Axel, that a creature more intelligent than the Icelandic horse does not exist. Snow, storms, blocked paths, rocks, glaciers, nothing stops him. He is brave, he is cautious, he is reliable. Never a foot wrong, never a false reaction. Should a stream appear, a fjord to be crossed, and they will appear, you will see him throw himself unhesitatingly into the water like an amphibian and swim across to the other side. If we do not upset him, if we let him do as he wishes, we shall cover our 25 miles a day, the one car rying the other. We will, I'm sure, but what about the guide? Oh, I am not worried about him. That sort of person walks without noticing. Our guide moves so little that he cannot possibly get tired. In any case, I will give him my horse if need be. I would soon get cramps if I did not take some exercise. My arms feel all right, but one must not neglect one's legs. We carried on meanwhile at a considerable pace. The countryside was already virtually deserted. Here and there an isolated farm appeared, a lonely boar 54 built of wood, earth, and blocks of lava, like a beggar beside a rough track. These dilapidated huts seemed to be imploring the charity of passers-by, and one would almost have offered them alms. In this region roads and even paths were completely lacking, and the vegetation, however slow-growing, soon hid the traces of the rare travelers. And yet this part of the province, a stone's throw from the capital, was considered one of the inhabited and cultivated parts of Iceland. What were the areas like then that were more deserted than this desert? After half a mile we had still not seen a single farmer at the door of his cottage, nor a single wild shepherd grazing a flock less wild than himself, only some cows plus a few sheep left to their own devices. What would the regions in turmoil be like, broken by eruptions born of volcanic explosions and underground upheavals? We were due to make their acquaintance later, but when I consulted Olsen's map, I saw that we were avoiding them by following the winding edge of the shore. The main eruptive movements are in fact concentrated in the interior of the island. There, the horizontal strata of superimposed 54 the house of an Icelandic peasant farmer. JV, rocks called traps in the Scandinavian languages, the trachytic strips, the eruptions of basalt, of tuff 55 of all the volcanic aggregates, the streams of lava and of molten porphyry, have produced a country of supernatural horror. I hardly realized at this stage what a sight awaited us on the Snæfell's Peninsula, where the damage wrought by an impulsive nature forms a fearsome chaos. 2 hours after leaving Reykjavik, we arrived at the Awalkirkja, main church, or settlement, of Gufunes. It contained nothing special. Just a handful of houses. Hardly enough for a hamlet in Germany. Hans decided to stop there for half an hour. He shared our frugal breakfast, replied, yes, or, no, to my uncle's questions about the nature of the road, and when asked where he intended to spend the night, Gerar was all he would say. I looked at the map to find out what Gerar was. I located a small community of this name on the shore of the Hvalfjord, 4 miles away from Reykjavik. I showed it to my uncle. Only 4 miles, he said. 4 out of 22. Just a pleasant stroll. He tried to say something to the guide, who did not reply but took up his position at the head of the horses and set off again. 3 hours later, still traveling over the faded grass of the pastures, we had to work our way around the Kallafjord, as detouring round this estuary was easier and quicker than crossing it.